Good evening, everyone. Sorry for the delay, but technical difficulties will just push you back. But I'm grateful that all of you hung in there with us. So what I want you to do for me is I want you to take this opportunity to press the share button to let everyone know that now we're live to continue in our conversation, politics, money, and social justice. We have some great panelists who have joined us this evening, and we're going to have a wonderful conversation as it relates to the power of women voting and their voice in our community and even in our nation. And so I want to thank you so much for being with us in the last two panels. It's been great to see the response. I hope this forum has informed you and empowered you how to vote. Thank you for already voting. We're voting the entire month of October. Continue to do that and encourage others, your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers to make sure that they vote during this month. We do not have to wait until November. We can do that today. So make sure you press the share button. If you have any questions, you can put that into the comments section, and we will try to get to your questions by the end of this segment. So since we're already starting late, we're going to jump into this, and I want to pretty much introduce our panelists today. I'm going to give you an abbreviated bio of everyone who's with us. So to my right, we have Dr. Rosalind Clark, artist who has earned for the second time in history to serve as the first female president of a college in the United States. She now serves as the president of Benedict College. She's a graduate from Vanderbilt University and West Virginia University College of Law. She holds several certificates, sits on several boards, and she's doing amazing things in our community. And we want to say thank you to Dr. Artist. We also have Representative Beth Bernstein, She's a graduate from the University of Georgia and the University of South Carolina. That's a contradiction, but we know she's okay. And so we're glad to have her. In November 2012, she was elected into the South Carolina House of Representatives for District 8, and she was reelected in 2014, 16, and 18, and she serves on several boards in our community. To my left, we have Councilwoman Tamika Isaac Devine. She's a wife, a mother, an attorney, city councilwoman, and entrepreneur. She's currently serving on her 5th term on city council here in Columbia, and she was the first black woman elected to Columbia City Council and the first African American to be elected citywide. So I want you to give it up for our panelists by putting some great emojis in the comment section as we get started. And so thank you again. Once again, share this, and if you have any questions, please post those questions in the comment section. So I want to start with you. They've allowed me to call them on a first name basis, so I'm gonna take advantage of this afternoon. So Tamika, thank you for being with us tonight. I want to ask you a question. How important is this election for women?
Wow. So I always tell people every single election is important. So we need to make sure we're engaged all the time. But I will say this election is so very important for women for multiple reasons. I mean, one, first and foremost, I think we are all very excited about the possibility of having our first female vice president. We call her our MVP, our Madam Vice President. So being able to really see women in that kind of position is amazing. But also, when we think about the issues that are on the ballot, we've got issues on the ballot from, criminal justice and our judicial system to housing, healthcare, women's reproductive rights. There are so many things that are at stake in this election. And so when you think about women and our role in this country, this election will really determine our lives, not just for our immediate future, but our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you so much for that. Beth, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. I want to start off by thank you for inviting me to be among these cherished, wonderful women who are absolute leaders in this town. And that's an excellent question. I think every election is important, but I think this is the most consequential election that we have and since in my lifetime, honestly. Not only do I feel like this election is going to be consequential because of our democracy and the rule of law that is at stake here, because of without getting too political, I don't know how political we can get, but I feel like I've been, as I stated earlier, an alternate reality because the past 4 years, we're not better off now than we were 4 years ago. And the erosion of our democracy is a very important topic that we all need to recognize. It's not about party. It's really about the rule of law and doing what's right and what's fair. And I think what we have seen the last 4 years is not what this country is about. And I am hopeful that because of conversations like what we're having, people have become much, much more engaged, and people are voting, because I think there's that sense, that dire sense that we feel like we've got to go vote. And while I've voted every year since I've been 18, that I've been, every election, which I'm proud to say, I don't think most people could really say that, but I think this election, people understand the gravity of why your vote matters, and it is your only voice that you have, really, to make a difference.
Thank you. Even with what you've just said, now being the president of your second college now, and you're leading that at Benedict, you have an awesome responsibility of influencing the next generation. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic. I know things are quite different for colleges all over. Are you seeing anything different with younger voters, younger female voters, and if you have, what have you seen with them?
So I am incredibly inspired by what I'm seeing. I think young women are engaged at exceedingly high levels by comparison to what we've seen historically. I think Councilwoman Devine has really amplified an issue. They see someone that looks like them. They see a woman on the ballot for the second highest office of the land. That, of course, engenders a great deal of pride and connectivity to this election. But much bigger and greater than that, our students have felt the weight of the pandemic, the twin pandemics. Our students have felt the weight of COVID-19. It caused them to be separated from the campus. It threw their families into financial tailspins. It has compromised every aspect of their lives and really interrupted life as they know it. It will take a leader with a steady hand to steer this country out of this pandemic. More importantly, perhaps, is the twin pandemic of systemic racism in this country. I lead a historically black college. The students I educate are overwhelmingly low wealth, first generation kids of color for whom issues of race are front and center. So the mere fact that there's a woman of color on the ballot is first and foremost important. But secondly, and equally important, is the idea that race is really on the ballot. The level of hate that we have experienced, the willingness of people to be forthright about their hatred and discrimination in this country in the last several years has really been amplified, and my students are paying attention. They're hearing it, they're seeing it, and unfortunately they're feeling it. And so I think they're much more engaged than perhaps they have been historically, and they have a lot at stake here.
Even with your conversation and your comments of them being aware, I think this, as you said, this is probably one of the most consequential, if not the most consequential election. I'm seeing teenagers having conversations about politics. I'm seeing them post about certain things that they see that was not there 8 years ago. And as you move forward and as we look at voting this year, looking at this election, politics is very important, but I'm not sure, as I shared with you all off screen, a lot of people didn't really understand the importance of politics because, as you said, it's something that they do over there. It doesn't really have anything to do with me. What made you get into politics to say, listen, I have to be at the table because there are certain things that need to be said, and I feel like my presence is valuable?
Well, when I first ran, I was in a prosecutor for the state attorney general's office, and I was prosecuting domestic violence and sexual assault cases throughout the state of South Carolina. And South Carolina, as with many things that are not always great, we are very high in incidents, and at the time we were number one in the nation for domestic violence, homicides, men killing women. And I was working and advocating for changes legislatively within our judicial system and in our local courts as well. And to that, it was very personal for me to make sure that we had people who were in legislative and policymaking positions who understood the issues that were front and center in our community and were making a change. And so I had made a proposal to the Columbia City Council at that time to do some revamping, training with law enforcement, a domestic violence court, and it was not met with yay, this is something we need to do. Now, I tell people all the time, now that I'm on this other side, I understand budgets and the challenges, and that even though something might be a worthy project, it may not be feasible to do it right away. But that really kind of got me really riled up to understand, who is city council? What do they do? Why do they make the decisions they make? And as I learned more about my city government, I grew up in Columbia. This is home for me. I learned that local government really affects our lives every single day, from, where our children go to school and how they're educated, to, the quality of life in our neighborhoods, to our local justice system, our magistrates and our municipal judges. And so I chose to run, and I was 28 at the time. The other thing I jokingly tell people, the youngest person on council at the time was our mayor, and he was 50. And at that time, I thought he was really old. Now that I'm closer to 50, I don't think that's that old. But I felt like representation matters. And I didn't see anybody up there that looked like me. There were no black females up there. There was no one under the age of 50. And I felt like I was a voice that was absent in the policy-making body. And so that's why I chose to run. And I tell people all the time, most people who are really passionate about public service and then offer themselves, because we don't get paid a whole lot. We deal with more complaints than we do people celebrating us. And so it really sometimes is a thankless job, but our thanks is when we are able to make a difference. And I think most people, when they offer themselves, it's because they're passionate about wanting to make their community better. And that's what, brought me. And I think it's interesting you mentioned about young people. I have a 15-year-old now who is very passionate about politics. And she grew up with parents in politics, but, to the point where even though she can't vote, she gets involved. And so those are the things that I think we need to be showing our young people about, how politics is important. Even if you're not an elected official, even if you're not even old enough to vote, it affects your life. And so she's been actually planning marches to protest the Supreme Court nominee at 15 years old, because she understands the importance that means to her life and the lives of the folks around her.
Well, since you brought it up, we saw what was happening today as relates to that questioning of the next Supreme Court appointee. Now, I wanted to ask this question: what are the challenges? What's at stake with this? And so, Beth, I'm gonna come to you. So, why is there such an uproar about this?
Well, there's a lot at stake, and part of it is kind of what I alluded to before. It's, this is not the process that the judge, Amy Coney Barrett was nominated, was not a typical process. It is being rushed through. It is being proposed at a time because of certain issues that they feel that she is going to be able to rule on, issues such as Roe v. Wade, issues dealing with the affordable health care, with the ACA. And those are two issues that are of utmost importance, and particularly the ACA, because there's going to be a hearing where the justices are going to determine whether or not to overturn, whether or not to take away insurance for 20 million plus Americans. And that's pretty serious. That is significant. And this is so unusual that there's never been this close to an election where a nomination process is being done. And there's never been a nomination process that I believe, don't quote me on the exact amount, but it's been more than 30 days. I think it's closer to probably 45 days. They're trying to have this nomination approved, voted, have her confirmed by November 10th or November 8th, I think is when that hearing is. And it's unfair. It's just, it's not what Americans want. Most people are on these issues feel pretty with the majority how Roe v. Wade is now. I believe a majority of Americans feel that way. ACA has helped a tremendous amount of people. We didn't expand Medicaid here in South Carolina, unfortunately. And these are issues that are of utmost importance, and people might think the Supreme Court justice nomination is not something that's going to affect them personally. This is very much so, and those are the two most pressing issues. But it's also the nature of replacing a justice such as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who did so much for women and equality and women in the workplace setting, and really for the three women up here, I think paved such a road for us. And to have her appointment be completely opposite in how she thinks and the conservative nature of it, and is politicizing the judiciary, which really there should be a separation of powers there. And it's very unfortunate what we're having to see. And I watched the questioning today, and it's not against just Judge Barrett's qualifications, it's just the process of how they're doing it and the conservative nature of what.
Okay, with what you've just said, what do you think this means for the next generation as relates to her seat, the decisions she will make as relates to the topics and the issues that are on the table? How does that affect what you do in your seat?
So, I would suggest that it affects the next generation, because the reality is a Supreme Court appointment is a lifetime appointment. And she's perhaps younger than all three of the women sitting on the stage right now, which means she will be on the Supreme Court when my children's children grow up and begin to exercise their rights. These are appointments to be taken incredibly seriously because of the lifetime nature of the appointment. This isn't a today issue. She will not stand for re-election. If the White House were to change, they can't go back and undo this. The president has the prerogative of nominating and seeking the appointment of a Supreme Court justice. As a woman, I will tell you that, and perhaps it's an indistinguished response, but it's tacky. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not cold. We did not even afford her the decency of waiting a decent period of time before trying to appoint a successor. It is indecent. It's simply indecent, and it speaks to the caliber of the individuals responsible for it. And that's not a criticism of Judge Barrett or her qualifications, just as been stated, but I think judges are known for being judicious and thoughtful. The decisions they make can last generations, if not ever. And so the appointment should be equally deliberative. The American people, Congress ought to have the opportunity to really study and think and be deliberative about the process of selecting a judge who will serve the remainder of their natural life. And so my children are bound by what happens in these next several weeks. My children's children may likely be bound by what happens in these next several weeks, and I think we all have a reason to be concerned about that. What's the rush? If her qualifications stand, her qualifications stand. There's no need to push through an appointment process that the vast majority of Americans think at its basic level is just distasteful.
I'm with you. I think it's rushed. I think when it comes down to leadership, leading even on a local level, and what I've seen is leadership isn't about creating a record of what you've done as relates to I've done more than this or I've done more than that. It is really about creating a track record and really creating a legacy that outlives you. Not I signed more bills than anybody else. I did this more than anybody else. This is not, we're not looking to try to change world records. This is not the Olympics, and to appoint really so many judges, even on around the country. I can't, it was 100 and something judges that was appointed by President Trump. But I don't want to jump on him with this because I want to make sure that I don't lean one way or the other, but I am concerned. And so when it comes to the legislation on a local level, you're having to make decisions and how things are impacted. But what can women do to influence what happens in this vote?
Well, of course, vote. And I think we will. I mean, when you look at women's participation in elections, we have very high participation, particularly African-American women. We vote in very high numbers for typically, normally, the Democratic candidate, but regardless of your party affiliation, Black women vote in awesome numbers. What I think that women need to do is also educate and encourage others about voting and how important it is. One of the things that I have continued to be disheartened about is the number, particularly of African American men who are choosing not to participate in the election. I've seen recent polling of the number of African American men who still say, my vote doesn't matter, I don't understand the Electoral College, I'm not going to participate. And when you look at the lack of participation and the margin of numbers that elected our current president and elections throughout the country, we make the difference. And so I would challenge and encourage women who, we take care of households, we take care of communities, we take care of colleges. We are the nurturers. We tend to be the folks who are always out there working. And so what I would say is that we need to take this on as a job and work to not only get people to the polls and get people voting, but also educated about the candidates, the issues. A lot of folks are focusing on the top of the ticket and the president and vice president, but we've got races up and down the ballot. We have a Senate campaign here in South Carolina. We have local school board races. And when you talk about our communities, those are very important elections. So I think we need to educate ourselves, educate other folks, and get people engaged in the process. And then elections, I always tell people this, voting is just the beginning of the process. What we also need to do is continue to be engaged throughout the process, hold our elected officials accountable, and engage throughout the off season so that we continue to be informed about the issues that affect our communities.
I'm glad that you brought up men. There are a lot of women that I've talked to who feel like male leadership is absent. Now, I'm all for men having responsibility and women as well. So I'm not a male chauvinist and a woman is supposed to stay home. I'm not that guy. However, do you feel that there is a lack of male leadership in politics or in our world now? Or do you feel like there's opportunity for things to turn where men can be more visible?
Yes.
I'm going to give it to any one of you who want to jump on that question.
Well, I think that's an interesting question because really I think men have taken that role as leaders, and it's been hard for women to really elevate themselves in leadership roles. You asked Tamika why she decided to run, and it made me think about why I decided to run. And I never thought about running for office. And really a man suggested that I run for office, and that's why I started thinking about running for office. It was not something that I grew up thinking that a woman could be president of the United States. But that is different now, and it's because of women before us and women now. And I'm so, so happy and thankful that the younger generation, the women that you're teaching and seeing on a day-to-day basis, they are more engaged and they are more active. And I think women are not taking men's places. I think there are issues we come to elected office or whatever position we're in with a different skill set. And I think that's important. And also, the reason why your vote matters is just on a micro level. Out of the 50 court of Court of Appeals judges that the Trump appointed, not one was of color. Not one. And to have a judiciary of mostly men and white men is not reflective of what the society is. And that's why your vote matters.
Thank you. Do you want to jump on that question, Doc?
So I think the short answer for me is absolutely there is margin, there is room for men to step up. I think men need to step up. I think if we look at the election results from the last general election, certainly there have been multiple elections since that time, but if we look at the general election and we think about voter turnout, particularly as it relates to men of color, I think we left a lot on the table. We left real opportunity to be heard as a community on the table. And so, yes, I would take the step of sort of calling out our brothers and saying, step up. Stand with us. We're trying to change the world. And we're not trying to change the world female, right? I think there's always this assumption that you just want everything to be women. No, I really don't. My husband is the head of my house. We have a family and there's a hierarchy and there's a structure. And I think men leaders can be as effective as female leaders. I think it depends on the context, the organization, the time, and the place. And so there's room for everyone at the table. But we all have to step up and own our share of the responsibility for ensuring that this world is equitable and fair for everyone.
Thank you. We have a question. So this question is from our audience. It says, what is the number one pressing issue for the city of Columbia right now? You have 60 seconds.
I would say for me, over the last 5 years, it's been elevated. I think it is poverty. As the capital city, we have around a 21 to 24%, depending on what numbers you look at, percent poverty rate. When you look at the challenges that we have in making and ensuring our community is equitable, it really goes to the disproportionate number of folks who are low wealth. And so I think that poverty is one of the biggest issues that we have in the city, and that we have got to really step up to make sure that we are providing opportunities for everyone to be economically stable and have economic mobility.
Thank you. Second part of that question is, what is the number one issue pressing you believe HBCUs? So I get that to you, Doctor.
If I could sing, I would sing money, 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 money. But I can't sing, so I won't. But sincerely, revenue and resources. Someone said to me today, as a matter of fact, well, HBCUs have gotten all kinds of money. Don't you think you all are okay now? Slight increases in funding over the last year or two does nothing to correct 100 plus years of underfunding, discrimination, and functioning, quite frankly, below the asset level of predominantly white institutions who are doing the very same work with, quite frankly, an easier population. Because our students have been disenfranchised, because our students have not had the same equitable K-12 opportunities, they have not had access to broadband, right? They have not had high-quality teachers and technology-infused classrooms. They don't have the cultural capital. They didn't come from college-educated families. Many are the first in their families to go to college. It takes a little more to support those kids, and we have done it on a lot less. And I think HBCUs, we got some catching up to do in terms of resource development in this country to really be as strong and powerful as we need to be for our students.
Thank you. So it's part C. I'm gonna give this one to you, Beth. It says, what do you believe is the number one issue for the state?
So, that's a good question. I was thinking through this, and, it's all intertwined. I think one thing about the pandemic with COVID-19, what has shown us is the disparity in how we educate people in this state, how we provide health care for people in this state. Broadband is a prime example of that. During last year, so many students weren't being able to educated. What was it? 10,000 students were unaccounted for. And as someone who is in the state legislature, and those issues have always been important to mainly all of my Democratic caucus, but really to see that disparity and how this pandemic has disproportionately affected the most vulnerable is something that's very pressing to me. And also, something that I think that we're probably going to talk to, and I don't know if this is a good segue into that, is the hate crime legislation. While that's not going to impact somebody on that level, there's some implications of having hate crime legislation that I've become very
And not to interrupt you, some people may be watching and don't know what that is. Could you explain it for them?
So, South Carolina is only one of 3 states, and it looks like Arkansas is probably going to pass something soon. The governor and the attorney general has embraced it, and we will probably be the last state standing. But we have no hate crime legislation on the books, meaning if you commit a crime based on some bias because of race, religion, gender, some form of class, and you commit a crime based on that bias, we don't have the laws on our books to prosecute you for a hate crime. Dylan Roof was, and that's an example to use just so maybe people could understand what a hate crime. That's the most heinous hate crime that we could, especially that we've endured in this state. And while he was on a federal hate crime charged, he could not be charged on a state hate crime. Now, he could be charged with murder and things of that nature, but it doesn't establish that it was a hate crime that was punishable because it was a hate crime, not because it was murder. And there's a difference, because as a community, I think it's a healing process. We need to stand up and say, you can't do this. You can't commit a crime because of someone's race or religion or gender, or whatever it may be. It's wrong. And as a community, we're going to stand up against that. And for South Carolina to be one of the last states to embrace that is, it's sad. I love this state, so I don't want to be too critical. It's where I was born and raised, right here in Columbia. But come on. I mean, South Carolina, we can do better. We are better. And I am still hopeful that we'll have some hate crime legislation passed, but it's a hurdle, and that's the one thing of serving an office that is always surprised me. The most common sense, practical idea that you would think would have no issue of passing, having an issue of being able to pass. You have roadblock after roadblock. And something like hate crime, who wouldn't want to say, yes, you committed this crime because of some bias, and you need to be charged and have an enhanced penalty because of it.
Well, I have a question. So do you may not be able to answer this, and if you can't, I totally understand. This was not one of my questions.
Okay.
Do you think that maybe one of the reasons why it's not being passed is because those who are in seat benefit from it not passing? So, for example, someone has a question here. Was talking about. Here's the question. The question is, how do you fight systemic racism when both sides do not acknowledge racism is a problem? That's the question, right?
Excellent question.
So if we have people on both sides not saying that racism is a problem, but yet some are elected into office, then it will be hard to pass that legislation because it's really not a problem, is it?
Correct. That is some mindset. When I ask people, because I've worked very hard to try to get, and a bunch of us have, to try to get this legislation passed, and typically it's my Republican colleagues who are hesitant, and they're like, we don't need it. And that goes in your thought process right now. Or they're going to be convicted for the crime of murder anyway, so why do we need to add to it by saying that it's a hate crime or enhance the penalty?
Where they say you can't legislate people's thoughts. I've heard that one.
Yeah, and in the Supreme Court, actually, in the case that this was modeled after, but you're right, that is an argument that is made, but I do think it's because people won't recognize that there is a problem. And we all know right here that
Right.
there is a problem.
No, there is a problem.
We can acknowledge it. We come from different backgrounds and you've got to be able to accept that we have a serious systemic racist racism problem in this state and in this nation.
Thank you. You know, I want to say this to you. I want to say thank you for saying what you said, because for many African Americans, we don't hear that much from someone who's not the same color. And I want to say thank you for someone to say, hey, no, this is an issue. This is a problem, because it seems as if, like, for example, depending on when you watch the news, I'm going to back up a few months. If you watch Fox, you get one perspective. If you watch CNN, you get another perspective. If you watch Fox, we're tearing up everything. If you watch CNN, you see protests. You see different things that, from depending on what perspective you're coming from. And systemic racism is an issue. Poverty is an issue. Then you have to know that even now in 2020, we still have students who are going to college, and they're the first generation to attend college. Now, while Beth was talking earlier, you were over there itching in your seat. So I want to give you the opportunity to respond to what you heard.
So I have to unpack my thoughts because I tend to jump all over the place. But as I was listening to the conversation around hate crimes legislation, it occurred to me, why does it matter? It matters because the enhanced penalty is an incentive or a disincentive to commit the crime in the first place. So while I cannot control your thoughts, I can manage your actions. You may think about it, but you're going to think twice before you act on it because of the enhanced penalty. I mean, what's the argument? What has been the argument historically for capital punishment, however you feel about that, right? If you know you could face death, you'll think twice before you take another life. If you know you'll face an enhanced penalty for acting on your racist tendencies or your sexist tendencies or whatever the case may be, whatever immutable characteristic you seek out to punish this week, you're going to think twice about that. And so I think it's one, disincentive for bad behavior. And number two, it is a public statement that as South Carolinians, we do not support ongoing systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, you name it, distinguishing between and among people based on immutable characteristics. That just isn't acceptable in the state of South Carolina. And I think enough of us believe that deeply that we're troubled by the fact that our colleagues and friends won't stand with us on that. And, you know, I am a transplant to South Carolina, but love it. My family and I love South Carolina. We plan to make this our permanent home, and it is troublesome to me. I'm raising children here. I want them to feel safe, appreciated, and valued. And so if my state does not think enough of me and my children to ensure their safety by disincentivizing violence against my children, then that causes me concern. And I think beyond that, the challenge with systemic racism and structural racism is most people don't even realize they're doing it. Right. And so education becomes even more important. And so while I applaud these two ladies for having the guts, quite frankly, to run for public office, it is a thankless job. It is brutal. People are cruel and unkind and unappreciative for the work that you do. And so I want to acknowledge both of you and just say thank you for being amazing and brave and courageous and awesome, because you represent us so beautifully. Some of us have chosen a path less traveled in a different kind of way, and it's education, because I think that's really the only way we change this. And I'll give you one example, and then I'll stop hogging the mic. When we look at incidences of police violence, when police have in hairpin trigger decisions, pulled the trigger on a person of color, or under very difficult circumstances, we've seen the stories play out over and over and over. If you look at the number of those officers that went straight from high school to the academy versus college and then to the academy, 99% of those negative consequences and outcomes occur with police officers who are not college educated, because the critical thinking skills, the higher order thinking skills that allow them to call on their training and to make good decisions and to see people as human first and suspects last, comes with education, right? Exposure, education, is a big deal. And so I think if we would focus on the right things, right, making sure our children have equitable and fair opportunities, making sure that our police officers are well educated and truly exposed to people who do not look like them, so that they don't view them as something less than human, a suspect, but rather as a human being worthy of a split second to stop and say, is this the right thing to do?
Thank you.
That was
You want to respond to that?
I would just add that, you know, when you have that exposure, when you have conversations, as uncomfortable as they may be, it starts an opportunity for things to get better. And what I think is that when you have folks who are in positions who are very comfortable with the status quo, or very comfortable with staying comfortable and don't want to have those conversations, we don't see change. And that's why you see the things where we are now. And so if we are actually going to go past where we are, there needs to be discussions and passing of hate crime legislation. There needs to be acknowledgement of systemic racism and the effects of that systemic racism that are still plaguing our communities today. And unless we're willing to do those things, we're going to get the same thing, and we're going to continue to have folks who are just very disenchanted with the entire process.
Thank you. So I have a question online. It says, what advice would you give a younger woman to help them navigate through our current political climate?
Pray.
So we got prayer.
Got vote. And I would certainly suggest that all is not lost. I mean, we left the conversation around the Supreme Court appointment, and I know the election obviously is coming up November 3rd, but that Senate is considering that nomination right now. And your senator needs to know how you feel about that. We need to keep that same energy that we're going to take to the polls and let he or she know that should this not go the way we'd like to see it go, there will be a punishment. Right? There will be an election result that goes a little differently. We will hold people accountable. And I think we have to send that message now. We can't wait till after the election to say, oh, we should have voted that person out, right? We have to be clear right now that if you support this, if you vote for this, if you advocate for this, we will vote you out next. And I think we have to.
Right. And I think that's a great point, because sometimes when you're watching the news, we just see the big ticket. So we just think the president and the vice president, but not understanding locally how we need the right people in city council and county council, those who represent us locally in the House and the Senate, understanding that they didn't have voice to then speak for us. That goes up the chain. And so I think it's so important that we understand that it's just not the president and the vice president that we are responsible for, but even on a local level. And I think as we continue to look at what happens over the next few weeks, I really think things will change. We have another question. I think we're going to have one more question, then we're going to conclude our evening. It says, as leaders, what are your thoughts on the governor's public declaration of delegating public school funding to private schools and now charter schools? Who would like to? Dr. Artis, you want to go second or first on this one? I call you doctor because the way you responded.
So I'm rolling my eyes and carrying on because HBCUs were caught in that crossfire. The governor made a commitment to historically black colleges in this state. He afforded us $2.4 million of that funding. When the lawsuit was filed to stop the additional distributions of that money, we were swept up in that. So we received notification today that there will be no revenue distributed to any private school in the state of South Carolina based on that Supreme Court ruling, including but not limited to the HBCUs who had a commitment for that money. That's problematic to me. So the Supreme Court's really important. That's problematic to me because the governor made the commitment and we obligated the money. My kids didn't have laptops. My kids didn't have hotspots. My kids didn't have access. And so we purchased $500,000 worth of equipment and distributed it out based on the governor's commitment to me. Because of this decision, Benedict now will not receive that money. And I'm left holding a bill for $500,000 of technology that we deployed this fall based on the governor's commitment to me. And so while I don't necessarily have a dog in the fight on the K-12, we're going to recruit K-12 students, whether they're public, charter, et cetera. I'm a public school girl myself. I support public schools. My children are being educated in public schools. So my preference obviously is for funding to support those public schools. But the fact that this Supreme Court case was used, in my opinion, used inappropriately to strip committed funding from HBCUs is appalling and disgusting to me.
You know, I had a conversation with someone about this. They were only thinking that the money that was being used was really for elementary, middle, and high schools. They were not thinking about colleges.
subject of the lawsuit was to stop the money from being distributed to private charter schools. On advice of counsel, I am advised, the governor's office, out of an abundance of caution, said, well, we better hold up on these private colleges too, just in case. And so while I disagree with that legal interpretation, to receive a letter today saying, based on the Supreme Court's ruling, we are affirming that you will not receive this funding. And so, again, HBCUs have been caught in the crossfire. We are an unintended beneficiary of a dispute that really had nothing to do with us. I don't think the people who brought the suit had a thought in their mind about harming historically black colleges. Their goal was to ensure that public schools had the funding they needed to get through this pandemic. And the fact that individuals have decided to sweep us up in that dragnet is very disturbing to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was tied to the HBCUs just to embolden their rationale for allocating that money. And I think because of how desperately some of our public schools, especially in our most vulnerable areas, need that money, it's pretty egregious, I think, to allocate that money through K through 12 to private schools. That's not what the intention was for the CARES Act money. And as we know, there are so many issues, broadband being one, technology. Even if you have broadband, even having the technology, a laptop to even be able to use, and not to allocate that towards the schools that really do need it, that are public schools, is egregious.
There's so much going on, and there's just a lot going on locally, nationally, even internationally, being in the middle of a pandemic. And I hope that what we said today has informed and empowered you to make a better vote on, if you have not already voted, and how to move forward. So I want to thank our panelists this evening. But what I want to do, I'm going to give each of you maybe 60 seconds to maybe give your last words or something you want to share with the audience that you want them to know. If not, we can pass on and then we can close. So I'll start with you.
I would say that our congressman, Jim Clyburn, always says all politics is local, and that is very true. And so we need to understand that politics is not only something that is in our lives to stay, but it is a way that we can actually have a voice, include voting, but even outside of that. So I would just encourage people to just get involved in, your local communities, learn more about what's happening and how politics affects your life, and then advocate for what's important and you're passionate about.
Thank you. Beth?
And I completely agree with Councilman Devine. I would probably want to talk about, because we didn't get a chance to talk about really voting and the importance, but where to vote, and what the legislature did with absentee voting. We passed a bill that would allow you to obtain an absentee ballot for any reason. State of emergency is the reason, because of the pandemic. And what that allows us is, starting last week, October 5th, or this past week, you can go to 6 satellite locations all over Richland County and go and vote in person. All you have to do is show your driver's license. They'll figure out which precinct which ballot you should have, and you vote. I did it this past week, 20 minutes in and out. Don't let the line discourage you, but there are 6 satellite locations, Park Lane being one of them, the Adult Center, the Masonic Church on Gervais Street. There's one on Garner's Ferry. We have them all around the county, and I would really impress upon you to go ahead and vote in person absentee, which is also commonly referred to as early voting, though technically it is considered an absentee vote. And so please go vote. This is the most consequential election that we will have really in our lifetime, or to my lifetime at this point, and it's very important.
Sorry, can I add something? And make sure you check your ballot before you leave. Make sure that you check your ballot before you leave. I know several people who have seen people that they did not vote for on their ballot. It happens. Machines mess up. So check your ballot before you leave.
And, even if you requested an absentee ballot that is being mailed to you. If you want to vote in-person absentee, you may do that. You can't mail back in that ballot. It would be best to not do that and turn it back in unused. But I would recommend go ahead and vote. And in-person absentee is probably the best way right now.
Okay.
Vote, vote, vote. Take a friend, take a family member. Do not wake up on November 4th and regret that you did not let your voice be heard in this election.
Well, listen, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you for watching, and thank you for hanging out with us, even though we had some technical difficulties in the beginning. I hope that you receive some information that will help you and empower you. Listen, we will be back here in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about social justice. So it's probably going to be a pretty hot topic. So we want to make sure that you join us then. So listen, have a great evening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.